I was born in the city, but raised in the suburbs. Both my parents were from the inner city. They worked for long hours and little pay to make sure I would have the life they never did. They moved here in June of 1997, about a month after my 7th birthday. To this day, I can't help but smile when I think of my dad lugging boxes around whilst doing everything he could to make sure Mum was comfortable. The idea of him, red-faced and flustered, but never once complaining. He was like that, always doing what he could to make those he loved happy. My childhood was pretty normal by all accounts, but one thing has always stuck with me: the tree. It was a huge beech that stood just outside my bedroom window, tall, strong, and full of knotholes. I remember how it never seemed to have leaves on it. My dad even got a tree surgeon in to check it over. He looked the tree over top to bottom. He even used some sort of harness and pulley so he could reach the very top. For a long time, I was scared of that tree. Its branches would tap against my window whenever there was the slightest breeze. Some nights it would even let out almost human, like moans, that would have me screaming for my parents to come in. Then, one day in late June, when I was around 7 years old, I came home from my new school to find my dad waiting for me on the front lawn. "Come with me, kiddo," he said with a glint in his eye. "I got something to show you." He took my hand and led me into the back garden. We approached the tree, and as we drew closer, I noticed a crude rope ladder hanging down its trunk. "Look up," he said, a smile spreading across his face. My eyes followed the knotted rope up, and I saw what he was so pleased about. I threw myself into his arms. "You built me a treehouse. I love you, Daddy." He threw his head back and laughed. "I'm glad you like it. I figured that you and the tree could get to know each other better. Want to go up and have a look?" He lifted me above his head and gently placed me in the entrance. I was in love immediately. This wasn't just some platform. It had walls and a roof, even holes for windows like the portholes on a ship. He must have spent all day making it. After that, the tree didn't seem all that threatening. Even the tapping on my window and the moaning now felt like an invitation to come out and play. I'd spend hours in there, playing with my toys, reading comics, you name it. I've always enjoyed my own company, and having this treehouse was like my fortress of solitude. I wasn't long before I didn't need to use the ladder to climb in. I'd just shimmy up the trunk using branches and hollows in the wood. I was in kid heaven. I remember the July of that year being ridiculously warm. Not even hot, but humid. I spent a lot of nights just laying in bed sweating. After about a week of this, I decided that I was going to sleep in the treehouse. That way I could at least get the benefit of what little breeze there was. I asked my parents, but they refused. They were worried I'd hurt myself by rolling out of the tree in my sleep. I knew I couldn't spend another night being kept awake by the stifling heat. So I made a plan. I waited in my room until my parents had gone to bed. I gave them some time to fall asleep before grabbing my duvet, a torch, and a few books. I snuck down the stairs, avoiding every creaking floorboard I could. The silence of the house at night seemed to amplify even the slightest noise. I made it to the back door and slowly unlocked it, every moment expecting one of my parents to walk in and catch me. I felt a shiver of excitement move up my spine as I gingerly turned the handle and stepped out into the warm night air. As soon as I was outside, I ran to the base of the tree. I put my things onto my duvet and made it into a makeshift sack. I tied the ropes of the rope ladder to it, scrambled up the trunk, and hauled it up after me. I'd made it. I laid out my duvet, turned on my torch, and settled down to read. Eventually, the bulb started to dim, and I decided to get some sleep. I awoke a little while later to a squeaking sound coming from above me. This wasn't particularly unusual. Squirrels inhabited the neighborhood, but this sound was more metallic. I was preparing to go back to sleep when I heard a thump, the thump of something on the branches higher up in the tree. I was immediately wide awake. I heard the scraping of movement along the boughs. This thing sounded big. I grabbed my torch and tried to shine it upwards to see what the thing was, but the dying bulb did nothing but highlight the darkness. I was terrified. I pulled my duvet over my head as I heard the noise getting closer and closer. I whimpered to myself, hoping that if I was quiet enough, the thing wouldn't notice me. Suddenly, there was a clatter on the roof of the treehouse, and I knew I had to get out. As I scrabbled towards the door, I heard a sharp intake of breath from above. When I threw my legs over the edge to climb down, I felt a leathery hand brush the top of my head. I immediately ducked and put my foot on a branch I don't remember being there before. It promptly snapped, and I felt a deep pain in my leg as I fell from the tree. When I hit the ground, the air was knocked out of my lungs. I put my hand to my shin, and it came away wet and bloody. As I stared stunned, I saw a dark shape descend from the tree. It stood over me, and I screamed. Immediately, I saw my parents' bedroom light flick on. When I looked back, the shape was gone. I could feel the branch that had snapped digging into my back, so I reached behind me and pulled it out from underneath me. I looked into my hand and screamed again. It wasn't a branch. It was a piece of bone, a human bone. Almost immediately, my dad burst out of the back door. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted. "Are you okay?" He swept me up in his arms and carried me inside. When he saw the blood pouring from my leg, he immediately called an ambulance. The rest of the night is somewhat of a blur. I remember the wound in my leg needing stitches, 7 to be precise. The doctor said it could have been much worse. The next morning, my dad came to see me with 2 serious-looking men in suits. Dad said they were policemen. After assuring me that I wasn't in any trouble, they proceeded to ask me a load of questions about the previous night. Every answer I gave, they wrote down in tiny notebooks. After that, they thanked us and left. I asked my dad why they were there, but he told me not to worry about it. I went home later that day. When I got there, I saw that the tree was surrounded by tape. About halfway up, there was a large hole cut in the side of it. I could see the tree was hollow. I asked what was happening, but my parents wouldn't tell me. They just made me promise not to go near it for a while. My dad cut it down a few weeks later. Years went by, and I'd often think about the tree. When I was 16, I finally asked my folks why they got rid of it. They looked at each other warily and told me to sit down. They told me everything. Apparently, the tree surgeon that Dad got to look at the tree when we moved in was not a good guy. He was a drinker and an abuser. My parents had no idea when they hired him. From what I was told, one evening he beat his wife and 2 children to death. He knew he had to hide the bodies, and he remembered our hollow tree. He snuck over late one night and winched himself to the top of the tree and dumped the bodies down the hollow trunk, along with a load of baking soda to disguise the smell. The humid weather spooked him, and he came back to top up the makeshift grave with more baking soda. The night I stayed in the treehouse just happened to be the night he came to do it. He'd been waiting for weeks. The bone I broke was the femur of his wife that had poked out of a knothole as the body decomposed. The police had to cut the hole in the trunk to get to them. Later on, I looked up the whole thing on the internet. I found an article on it, and what I read sent ice down my spine. What my parents didn't tell me was that his daughter wasn't quite dead when she was dumped into the tree. Apparently, she could have been alive for weeks, starving, eyes burning from the baking soda with nothing but rainwater from the occasional rain shower to drink. Her father had beaten her face so badly she couldn't cry out. All she could do was moan. My wife and I have always lived a quiet life in the country with our son, Wesley. Our 9-acre property is surrounded to the north and the east by a forest, where Wesley would often go play with his friends or by himself. For his 8th birthday, I had gone into the forest with Wesley to help him make his own tree fort where he could stash his comic books, Game Boy, toys, and treasures that he would find while exploring the woods behind our house. He amassed quite the collection of interesting rocks and bugs, which he stored in mason jars, in his forest base, and he spent most of his free time just a few hundred yards away from our house. It was a peaceful life that we had for ourselves. I would take our car into work on the weekdays and bring my wife to town right after Wesley's bus arrived to take him to school. Each day was the same routine, and we spent the weekends together at the house. In short, we were all very happy. This week is the 6th anniversary of my son, Wesley's disappearance. To this day, we don't know what happened to him on that brisk autumn evening, but from the moment our 12-year-old son left the house, we had a sneaking suspicion he was never coming back. On Friday, August 23, 2013, our daily morning ritual happened as it always had. I would wake up, eat breakfast with Kim and Wesley, and we would wait together until the bus arrived. Wesley had a half day at school today, so he would return home before me or my wife were able to get home and watch him. This wasn't a big deal. He was 12 and could look after himself for a few hours. We told him to call my cell phone as soon as he got home after school that day to make sure he was home safely. As Wes climbed up the stairs onto the bus, my wife began to tremble and eventually break into tears. Neither of us knew what she was crying for, but we waved our son goodbye and both climbed into the car to finish off the work week. My cell phone rang at exactly 12:33 that afternoon. My iPhone played the default marimba tone, and I saw that I was receiving a call from our home landline. It must have been Wesley, who had just gotten off the bus and ran into our home, obeying my instructions to call. When I slid my finger across the screen and answered the phone, the only thing I heard was the empty dial tone of our home landline, as if he hadn't typed out my number yet. I called out his name a few times through my cell, but there was nothing. I tried calling back, but there was no answer. He did as he was instructed, called Dad as soon as he got home, and must have sprinted out the door to go play in the woods. I thought nothing of it until I got home. I picked up my wife from the store on the way back to the house. The porch lights were on, which was our family's way of indirectly saying, "Someone's home." Upon entering our house, I called out to Wesley to see if he was in his room. I got no response, so I assumed he was still outside in the woods, even 5 hours after his call. My kid always loved that fort that I built him. Kim began making dinner, and I changed my clothes and went to the spot in the woods where my son and I had constructed his home away from home. It was starting to get dark, so it was a bit difficult to see through the woods. I spotted the light from his treehouse lamp on through the window, and, as a dad should, began silently creeping up the short ladder nailed into the tree to scare the crap out of him. When I reached the top, I quickly swung the curtain door open and let out a roar in an attempt to scare my poor, unexpecting son. However, after scanning the small room, Wesley wasn't sitting in his beanbag chair as he normally was. In fact, the chair and his entire collections of rocks, bugs, comics, and games were completely gone off of the wooden shelves. The only things in the room were the lit citronella camping lamp that we had given to him when we built the treehouse, and a single Skechers sneaker lying in the middle of the room. The shoe was facing the doorway. I walked over to pick it up and examined it in the light of the treehouse lamp. Nothing was unusual about it, but it was Wesley's. I peeked out the window, wondering where my son could have run off to with only one shoe. The darkness had started to creep over the entire forest, and it would be very dark in no time. I called out into the twilight several times, with no response. He was probably waiting and hiding to scare me, and it was working. I was terrified already. I left the lamp on and descended the ladder of the treehouse, continuing to scan the dim area for my son. I called and searched for 30 minutes in the dark, getting no response. I was beginning to panic. Sprinting back in the direction of our home, I noticed that the light in his room was on. A wave of calm and relaxation washed over me. He must have snuck home while I was out here searching for him, little bugger. I opened the back door and entered the kitchen, immediately greeted by my wife, asking about the shoe in my hand and where her little Wesley was. I explained what happened, and she told me he hadn't come home. Once again beginning to panic, I sprinted down the hallway to his room and flung the door open. The light to the room was off, and the interior was completely bare. I know that I saw his light on when I was returning home from the woods. I flipped the light on with my right hand, still clutching his sneaker with my left. The room was completely empty. His bed, dresser, posters, rug, and bookshelf were completely gone. My wife heard my scream and came instantly rushing to my side. Then she screamed too. We didn't scream at anything we saw, but by the complete lack of something that was before us. Wesley and his possessions were nowhere to be seen, besides the shoe that I clutched. Examining it once more in the bare light of his room, a single word had appeared on the sole of his shoe, but only when viewing it in his room. The word didn't appear anywhere else in the house, only his room. The word "don't" was clearly visible in black block letters on its bottom. Kim immediately called the police and reported a theft, kidnapping, missing child, breaking and entering, everything. I had already grabbed a flashlight and was combing the woods, looking for any signs of my missing child. The police arrived, and I told them everything that had happened. The police helped us search the woods and surrounding area for hours. We searched for days, then weeks, months. Wesley never returned to our house. Once a week I would visit his hideout in the woods, which was now overgrown from the months spent untouched, and I left food and water in hopes that he was hiding somewhere in the woods. But the food just sat on the floor, rotting and filling with bugs. The time blended together, and we began to gradually lose hope of ever seeing our boy again. An entire year passed, and I continued to make weekly trips to the hideout just in case he would someday return. August 23rd, Wesley's disappearance anniversary, landed on a Saturday in 2014. I reclined in silent mourning on my love seat while I recalled the events of exactly 1 year ago. As I sat on the couch, my cell phone rang. The caller ID was our home landline, but I looked over to see our clunky phone set in its home on the dock. No one was using it. The time on the clock next to it read 12:33. I frantically answered the phone, hoping to hear something, anything. Dial tone, just like 1 year ago. Today I had brought Wesley's favorite snack, Cheetos, and an Arnold Palmer sweet tea to bring to his hideout, but I forgot them on the counter as I sprinted out of the house. It didn't matter. I climbed the ladder of the fort and flung the curtain open. It had smelled bad because of the rotten bread that I had left last week, but I would take last week's meal back to the house whenever I left. Half expecting to see the bare room, as I had every single week following his disappearance, the long, burnt-out citronella lamp flared on with my entrance, revealing the object sitting in front of me. Wesley's other shoe, once again facing the door. In stunned astonishment, I scooped up the shoe, examining it for another word. Once again recalling 1 year ago, I sprinted as fast as I could back to the house. The light of his room was mysteriously on. I blazed past Kim in the kitchen and beelined straight to Wesley's room. I paused for a moment outside the door, noticing that no light was visible under it, the same as it was 1 year ago. I opened the door as Kim ran down the hall and followed me. She realized what I had discovered, and together we shared the same mixture of anguish and hope as I flipped on the light switch. The empty sole of the shoe now displayed another single word: bother. We looked at each other in silence as the tears streamed down our faces. I placed the shoe next to its partner in the center of the room, reading the phrase, "Don't bother." Each year since, my wife and I have found another piece of Wesley's clothing in the treehouse. The clues only appeared on August 23rd, after I received the phantom phone call from our home landline at exactly 12:33. When I received the call in 2015, I had requested the day off from work. I waited, with phone in hand, at the bottom of the ladder of the treehouse. As soon as my expected call rang, answered, and repeated the dial tone, I flung myself up the ladder into the treehouse. Same scene as before. Curtain open, light on, an object in the middle of the floor. This time, Wesley's pants lay on the floor, feet facing the door. Grabbing them and sprinting to his room felt all too familiar. I flipped the light on once again and read the next word on them, printed this time on the butt of the jeans. This year, the word was looking. August 23rd, 2016. It became tradition for me on these days to miss all other obligations. I wanted to figure out this mystery of my son. The time was 12:32, and I sat cross-legged in the empty hideout, waiting as the seconds ticked by until the inevitable phone call. To my surprise, my phone clock ticked to 12:33, and no call arrived. I waited for another minute, then 5, then 10 minutes. Giving up, I descended the ladder. Once my feet touched the ground, my phone instantly rang. Home landline. Repeat last year. The curtain, lamp, and object. This year was Wesley's shirt. The same striped, long-sleeved t-shirt I had last seen him in. In his bedroom, I read the next word, printed across the back. 4. I already dreaded what next year would bring. I knew that the next word was going to be him. Some sadistic asshole had kidnapped my son and stole all of his possessions, and now they were toying with me, throwing in my face the fact that I completely failed as a father. August 23rd, 2017. I waited outside the hideout for the call once again. I stood on the tiny deck in front of the curtain until I received the call, but it never came. It seemed that nothing would happen until I was completely on the ground, away from the treehouse. I climbed down the ladder, received the call, and returned to the fort. Wesley's underwear. This was a bit messed up, if you ask me. However, each article of clothing I had retrieved from the fort was completely clean, as if it was washed that day. The underwear was no exception. Returning to his room, my hunch upon the next word was completely proved wrong. M.E. Placing the underwear next to the rest of the clothing, I read the words in order. Don't bother looking for me. Now, it's 2018, and my son's disappearance anniversary, if you can call it that, was 3 days ago. Nothing showed up in the treehouse, no phone calls, no clothing. I checked. Nothing new was added to this puzzle of his disappearance. I checked his room last night to see the 5 pieces of clothing in the room, as I did quite often, but nothing was there. On the 6th anniversary of his disappearance, all the articles disappeared. No one could have taken them. I had boarded up the window to Wesley's room and locked the door 3 times over. Those clothes were the last mementos that me and Kim had of our little boy, and now they were gone too. In the summer of '95, I moved to a rural town in Colorado with my parents. I was 12 years old and in desperate need of new friends. Our new house was right next door to a couple with a boy named Michael, who happened to be around my age. Because our school was so close to where we lived, we ended up walking together every morning. We would talk about girls, cars, and I guess everything else that 12-year-old boys tend to talk about. After the first week, Michael told me about a pool party he was having at his house that weekend. He told me that a lot of the cool kids from our school would be there, and that he could help me get off to a good start here. But there was just one catch. Before I introduce you to everyone, I need to know that you're cool, he told me on our way to school one day. He suddenly stopped walking and stared right at me. I'm cool, man, I said in my best cool guy voice. Well, you're the new guy, so you'll need to prove it. How? I asked. I was willing to commit murder, but I tried not to sound too desperate. There's a treehouse in the middle of this forest, a little ways out of town. Nobody knows who built it, but everyone says that the forest is haunted. Haunted by what? I looked at him so intensely, I'm surprised his eyes didn't collapse into their sockets. "You'll have to find out for yourself." He smiled like only someone does when they have a really good secret. "So, you want me to go there, huh?" He nodded his head. "Alone, for an entire night. I'm going to send someone check on you to make sure you're there, so you better not chicken out." That night I snuck out of my house once my parents were asleep. I rode my bike through the darkness, occasionally glancing down at the directions Michael wrote down for me. I turned down a dead-end street with some dense woods at the end. I walked my bike into the trees and followed the trail for what seemed like forever. I stopped in my tracks as if someone had extended their arms and pushed against my chest. When I looked up, I saw the treehouse. It didn't look nearly as old or creepy as I had imagined, even in the pitch-black darkness. I shined my flashlight on it and saw the uniformly straight planks of wood that acted as a ladder. Once I reached the top, I pushed open the wooden door on the bottom of the treehouse and climbed inside. The inside of the treehouse was surprisingly spacious and clean. I moved the beam of my flashlight around, marveling at the meticulous care and detail that went into building this mysterious structure. There were 2 windows, one facing north and the other facing west. The treehouse was farther up than I expected, giving me an impressive view of the black abyss below. I swung my backpack off and removed the contents on the treehouse floor. I had brought some snacks from home, a flashlight, sleeping bag, and a portable radio. The radio was mostly to keep me calm and make me feel like I had at least some sort of company. I stared out the window facing west and watched the breeze rustle the leaves, occasionally giving an eerie whistle. I looked at my watch, and its glowing green face told me it was just after midnight. I sat down with my legs crossed and turned the radio on, holding it in my hands. Michael Jackson's "You Are Not Alone" came on. I couldn't tell if it was more creepy or just ironic, so I decided to let out a nervous laugh. My brief sense of well-being was abruptly shattered by the wailing of a siren in the distance. The sound cut through the blackness like a knife, and I couldn't move a muscle. The music from the radio suddenly stopped, and a very stern-sounding man's voice came on. An inmate from ADX Florence Penitentiary escaped approximately 25 minutes ago. The inmate's name is David Harris, and he is considered extremely dangerous. Harris was charged with the murder of 3 men and 1 woman back in 1989. If you see him, please contact local authorities immediately. All residents of the immediate area are encouraged to stay inside for the time being. The radio had started playing music again, but all I could do was just stare at it with a slack-jawed gaze of terror. My parents didn't tell me there was a prison so close to where we lived, which was probably a strategic choice on their part. I wasn't quite sure how far the prison was from the treehouse, but the siren sounded like it was roughly a mile or 2 away. My fingers clutched the radio as I contemplated what to do next. I could bail out and pedal like hell back home, but everyone would think I was a wuss. Was Michael lying about someone coming to check up on me? All I could think was this was the worst possible place I could be, the perfect hideout for an escaped murderer seeking refuge from the law. When my body finally unfroze, I went over to the window that faced north. The sinister wailing of the prison siren made the forest come alive to me. Every movement in the trees made my eyes go wider and my heart beat faster. I suddenly noticed something moving through the trees. It was moving swiftly through the thick foliage. I tried closing my eyes and breathing for a few seconds, hoping it would go away. I opened my eyes and it was still there, moving closer to the treehouse. I couldn't exactly identify it as being a person or animal, but it was definitely alive and coming towards me. It was too late to leave now. I was stuck. With my eyes fixed intently on the shadow-drenched trees below, I noticed the violent moving had stopped. I looked around frantically, peeking over the square opening in the wall for some sign of life. It was then that I heard the sound of shuffling around the tree that I was in. I crouched down into a ball in the corner of the treehouse, trying so hard not to make a sound. Whoever or whatever it was started climbing up the ladder on the tree. I thought I heard heavy breathing from outside, but it could have just as easily been my own. I couldn't go out this way. I at least had to put up a fight. I grabbed my flashlight and waited for the monster, or murderer, or whatever, to come up through the door in the floor. The second the door flew open, I swung my flashlight as hard as I could. Ow! God! What the hell? A scrawny kid with a shaved head climbed into the treehouse. I came here to check on you. I'm Tyler, Michael's friend. I'm sorry, man. I heard the sirens and saw something moving through the trees, and I guess I just thought you'd murder me with a flashlight. Yeah, I heard about the escaped killer. It's why I came out here. See if you were okay. Well, thanks. I've kind of been freaking out up here, to be honest. At least you found it. Most of the new guys just get lost and give up. I haven't seen you in school yet. Are you new here too? Me? Nah, I've just been out sick for a while. Come on, let's get out of here. Tyler flew down the ladder of the treehouse, and I didn't hesitate to follow him. We started walking through the trees when I heard some rustling a couple 100 feet back. I think there is something back there. I know, Tyler said coldly. He's getting closer. You need to run. Who is getting closer? I flew into a full-on sprint, glancing back to see a behemoth of a man in an orange jumpsuit gaining on us. He seemed tall as a skyscraper, a malevolent force of nature plowing its way through the trees with murderous intent. I saw Tyler come to an abrupt stop. What the fuck are you doing? Come on, I called after him, but my body wouldn't allow me to stop running. Keep going, Tyler shouted at me. When you get to the fork in the path, go right and it will take you out. I kept calling for Tyler to join me, but all I could hear was the faint sound of the prison siren and the thrashing of heavy brush as the enormous man got closer to Tyler. I heard a blood-curdling scream behind me, but my legs kept moving me forward across the damp forest floor. I broke out of the woods and kept running down a series of empty streets until I reached my house, breathless and terrified. After a completely sleepless night in the comfort of my own bed, I ran downstairs into the light. I had never been so happy to be in the light. I never thought I'd see it again. Michael walked out of his house next door, and I dashed over to meet him. He started grinning from ear to ear as soon as he saw me. Mike, the craziest shit happened last night. I was all set to launch into my harrowing tale when he interrupted me. You find Tyler's treehouse. Tyler's treehouse. I thought you said nobody knows who built it. Well, that part I wasn't being totally truthful about. Him and his dad built it together last year, before he got really sick. Yeah, he mentioned he's been out of school. Yeah, for about 3 months now. He died a few weeks ago. Cancer. Michael looked at me with a little smirk, but his eyes remained sad. He died. I felt like someone had sucked all of the air out of my lungs. Yes, he did. I told you the forest was haunted. I didn't stay the whole night. It was all I could think of to say at the time. That's okay. Michael patted me on the shoulder. I think Tyler likes you, so you're cool.